Welcome everyone. Today we'll have a new amazing Necromancer build we'll be learning. Now some of our viewers have been asking me to teach this particular build with over 3000 corruptions with a Necromancer. And before we dive into the replays, I do want to highlight the cheap and also accessibility of this build. I have made a build with only one legendary potential on most of the items, and as you can see over here, and the chest does have 2 legendary potential, but this also shows you what you can get with those items. And one of the best part about this build is the ability to gain tons of cold penetration using this particular set item. That's right, this set item will give you Wraith over 120-30% cold penetration, and the bonus damage coming from the Dread Shed is converted to cold. And this allows your Necromancer Wraith to deal tremendous damage and also even higher damage when enemies has higher defense. So over here, we'll be learning this build from one of our Korean friend, who I am not sure how to pronounce his name. The Google translation says it's Lulu, so we can call him Lulu or call him our Korean friend. So let's briefly have a look at some of his replays with this particular setup, with the the tier 4 temporal Sentinel dungeons and with other content. You can see right away, the build does a lot of damage. And if you fast forward to another Corruption 3000 boss fight, you can see here him preparing up with his Wraith and then dealing tons of damage to the boss, over millions and also millions of damage, and while keeping himself alive. Yes, this particular build is quite glass cannon, as you're gonna see in the builder's guide, because this build is rather cheap. It builds for some essential damage, but it doesn't build for that much survivability. And this means you're constantly using your Wraith as a DPS and also a tank, while hitting over millions of damage and also tons of damage per second, and keeping yourself alive with mobility and also blink with transplant. And this is quite interesting, because the build itself is very cheap to start and also to craft, and the build has some extremely high powers in the endgame. Now coming from this new setup, you can see our Necromancer friend is dealing over 16 million damage against 3000 level corruption bosses. And he has also mentioned in the comments, he can do over 50 or 60 million damage against the testing dummies. So this is an amazing high damage glass cannon build for the endgame for the Necromancer. So if you come over to some of the replays of the demonstration of the build, you can see our Korean friend Lulu has started to buff his Wraith, and after that he will be running through the map with a delicate dance. Yes, I'm calling this one the delicate dance simply because the build is not built to sustain all the damage. He's constantly avoiding AoE damage while allowing the Wraith to deal the most damage. Simply because the build is not going to be building too much defense, he is not going to take direct damage whenever he can. He's going to avoid it, blink around, and also let the Wraith to one-shot anything with over 3000 corruption. And a lot of our viewers has been stressing this out. They're saying a lot of our build is 2 to 3 legendary potential, and I'm quite excited to be showcasing this build with an alternative setup that can be very cheap while achieving for higher corruptions. There is a drawback, guys. You are quite glass cannon as the Necromancer compared to the previous Necromancer build. Now as we watch a few of the replays, you can see this build still have some great defensive capacities, and over here this is a great demonstration. You can see that after killing the Exalted Mage, our Necromancer friend all of a sudden is sitting at over 60,000 warding. This is because playing in the higher corruption dungeons, the monsters have so much HP, and the special unique effect of your relic is that you'll be gaining up to 6% of their maximum HP as warding. So yes, the build has some defensive capacities, it's not all in terms of offense. So those of you that want to survive with a build with some learning of the mechanics and also skill rotations, you can be doing great in terms of tons of damage while sustaining yourself with tons of warding gain. Now before we jump over to the builder's guide, a big thank you to our Korean friend Lulu over here for sharing tons of great builds with the Necromancer and also sharing his progression. And what I recommend is, in some of those comments, some nice viewers have stated out some mechanics. In other videos, I recommend coming over here, use the translation function with Google to read some of his notes. Of course, I'll be explaining some of his notes and also provide you guys with a variety of the build he has recommended, so this way you guys can get the best out of this Necromancer experience while trying with some of the cheap gears he recommended. Now, Lulu here does have tons of great videos for the endgame Necromancer, and also he's moving towards a Spellblade, which I'm quite interested to learn as well. So definitely come over to his YouTube channel, subscribe, and also follow him for tons of great endgame content with the Necromancer. So coming over to our builder's guide, you can see I have made several tabs open over here to show you guys the demonstration. So what is happening is Lulu has provided two versions of the builder's guide. One is less defensive, yes, it's even more squishy, against the boss. So he has provided his version of the build against the boss, and also his version of the build when he's running through the Monolith. And you can see there is a difference in terms of resistance, there are some changes with the gears, and we'll go through this as well. Now, in order to make the build cheap and also accessible to you guys, I have made the two versions of the build that is recommended by Lulu, but also removing some of the most expensive gears in the game that is required. So here we're not going to look into the Jungle Queen's belt, but rather we're looking to a version with only Exalted belts. And also we're only using one legendary potential with a Julius Obsession. There will be a version provided for you guys if you happen to have the more expensive version if you want to go to 2 legendary potential. But the bigger focus of this guide is to make it cheaper, accessible to you guys to try some new build, and also doesn't have to cost much for crafting those gears. So coming over to a short explanation of the build. If we come over to the skills, you can see Wrath Lord or Summoning Wrath is maxed out as much as we can. Now the build has 29 skill points for Summoning Wrath Lord, and this allows the build to dive into the 10% multiplier over here while gaining additional health for the Wrath Lord, which can be converted into additional damage. The build also went over here for additional armor shredding chance, but I don't think this is a massive factor, as the zombie will be eaten right away very quickly. Now, one of the highlights for the build is its ability to kill monsters under the threshold of 15%, and you will see in the skill rotations how he will blink into the monsters and one-shot them once they get low. Together with the ability to fear monsters and also gaining additional armor, and also his unique mechanics that he'll explain to drink potions to reduce the cooldown of transplant, you can be blinking around and become very mobile and also dodging a lot of spells. Now, in terms of the Infernal Shade, there's not much has changed. This will be a permanent buff that will be dealing additional damage for your minions. One highlight over here is going to be the Dread Shade. He did go into this point, which allows him to buff minions not inside of the area, while over here gaining additional damage for his Wrath Lord while taking damage over time. So this is going to be the bigger difference for this build. Now in terms of the passives, it is very similar to what we had previously. There are some minor changes to preference and also for different damage multipliers. So we don't have to go through the skills or passive too much. But one of the biggest highlights is why we're using this particular set item. While coming from Lulu and also my understanding, this item is extremely cheap and also attainable to most of the Necromancer players. Likely you have 1 copy or 2 copies as you play the game, and you can find those on the market, or you can find those quite easily. The highlight for this item is tons of intelligence and also ward retention from the Implicit, together with turning Dread Shade, which is gonna be one of our biggest damage spells, into the cold damage bonus. And this will give tons of cold damage to our Wrath Lord, together with the ability to gain even more cold spell damage for summoned minions, and also tons of cold penetration per intelligence. So this is the biggest highlight. We're sitting on close to 130, 140 intelligence, and this means the minions affected by the Dread Shade, which is going to be Wrath Lord, will gain over 100% cold penetration. So you'll be dealing cold damage using this particular weapon together with narcotic damage. So we're trying to deal both forms of damage against the monsters. Now over here, Lulu has recommended using this particular one-hand sword, which will provide minions with additional cold damage and also additional skill rank for your narcotic minions as well. Once crafted with minion spell damage, this item is great with only 1 legendary potential. Because we already have tons of cold penetration, we don't need additional cold penetration if we don't have the 2 legendary potential on the weapon. There is another form over here you can get even more cold penetration, but it's not going to be the biggest deal of course. So 1 legendary potential well crafted on this weapon is enough for this build. And this is also the case for Lulu, whose current setup is sitting on 123 intelligence using a 1 legendary potential sword and also 1 set item. Now because we're referring back to the original setup from Lulu, our Korean friend, I do have a small unsolved puzzle that I want to ask you guys. I'm not sure why our Korean friend purposely left the poison resistance to 7%. This is the same for both versions of the build. And if there's a purpose for leaving the poison resistance as low as we can, please let me know in the comments, guys. I have adjusted my future builds into the form that we have covered the poison resistance. And just in case this was a mistake, please let me know in the comments if we should leave the poison resistance as low as we can. Now, because you guys might be familiar with some of our previous Necromancer build, I'll briefly go through the other items. The Wraith Lord's helmet is essential for the build. And here you want to get tier 6 or tier 7 intelligence, because intelligence scales the most for the build and also give us more ward rotation, more damage. Together with the chest, which will be going with increased skill ranks to summoning Wraith Lord and also intelligence if possible. If you can't get intelligence on the chest, getting the increased skill rank is also really good. We'll be going with the tier 7 minion damage onto the death rattle. If you can't get tier 7 guys, getting tier 6 or even tier 5 can also work over here. The reason we're using Death Rattle is because of the minion critical multipliers. Because we'll be giving our minions the buff to always critical strike, and having higher critical multipliers means even more damage. Now, I have mentioned the relic briefly in the demonstration at the start. This particular relic is very powerful, especially over 1000-2000 corruptions. Here, when enemies or allies die next to you, you'll be gaining ward up to 6% of its maximum health. And this is great as zombies, as minions die, and especially when strong enemies like the Exalted Mage die next to you, you'll be gaining over 30, 40 or even 60,000 warding because those monsters have so much HP. Now this is a waving item, means that you'll have to random tons of stats. Ideally, you want to get higher intelligence on this item, and optimally, you want kind of intelligence, minion damage, resistance and also health, but those are very hard to be rolled by. So if you can get anything with tier 5, tier 6 intelligence, that's already really good. Now for the final piece of the unique item that is crafted in the legendary. Julia's Obsession is a great item that provides stats for our minions. So for this item, we're providing spell damage, resistance, and also additional resistance together with the ability to convert lost HP into warding. And this, of course, as you're gonna see in the replays, our Korean friend is using the Wraith Lord as a tank as well. As it loses HP, you will be gaining additional warding. So this will help the Wraith Lord to become even tankier. Now, it is also recommended to have increased casting speed on these gloves, because this will be transferred into the Wraith Lord to allow it to deal even more damage. But as you guys gonna see in the cheaper version, it is not required. It will give us tons of increased damage together with the spell. But ideally guys, if you can't afford those items, you can start with a basic set. Now the boots and also the reins are pretty straightforward. We'll be trying to gain as much minion damage as we can while teleporting using this experimental Affix. You don't have to craft this one onto any unique items, and that's the highlight for the build. We will be stacking some cooldown reduction as we can because we want lower cooldowns for transplant. As for the reins, getting some intelligence, minion damage, and also resistance can go a long way, together with the implicit to deal more minion critical strike damage. Finally, for the belt, because we want to be summoning zombies while using potions, the belt that provides us with the most potion slot will be ideal. So usually guys, we talk about the Jungle Queen's belt, and this belt is very expensive to even get for the 1 legendary potential. Our Korean friend was very lucky to get this one onto 2 legendary potential. But for most of us, if you cannot get that build, having this kind of build can also work. Now, a lot of Necromancer players are recommending to only summon 2 to 3 zombies at most, because the Wraith Lord will be too distracted killing zombies and feeding on them instead of doing damage. So what they are recommending is, they are saying that you don't want to summon more than 2 or 3 zombies. So the maximum you go is a tier 4 for the summoning zombies. If you start to summon 4 zombies, it actually wastes a round of feeding time from the Wraith Lord, and that actually takes away your damage. So even though we're getting less bonus damage with a tier 2 Affix, this could be the ideal setup for the optimal damage between the time spent on feeding zombies and also the time spent on killing monsters. Now as you see over here guys, we'll be going with additional potion slots as a tier 7 if possible. If you can't, getting a tier 6 with 2 more potions also works. So we want as many potions as we can, while getting some defense and also summoning zombies to feed our Wraith Lord to deal even more damage. Now in terms of the idols, our Korean friend has recommended to get as much minion damage as possible in terms of cold and also narcotic, together with the ability to lower the cooldown speed for transplant, and this will be a variety of the form. So you can see 2 of those are going for cold, while the rest of the idols are just here for the narcotic damage. He's not using Arrow of Decay, keep that in mind. We're just here for the narcotic damage and also additional ways of applying Mark of Death for additional damage. Now coming over to the blessings. Our Korean friend has recommended getting more resistance, while after main and maxing the build a little bit, I was able to get a little more health. So here I went for more health, critical strike avoidance, additional minion damage, additional physical resistance, and also finally warding per second. Now if you do want to have like a Lulu's previous setup, you can see that he was going with void resistance and also lightning resistance because he didn't craft all the gears with additional resistance. So I have main and maxed the build a little bit compared to what he was using. Now I have mentioned that I will briefly go through the notes from Lulu, and those are translated notes of course. So one of the highlights a friend recommended is using a 2.5 second movement speed cooldown option on the belt. I have made a cheaper version of his recommendations. So basically what you're doing is you're drinking potions so you have less cooldowns of your traversal spell with transplant, and this reduces up to 2.5 seconds. And this will take this particular spell from 5 seconds to close to 2 or 2.5 seconds. And this allows you to constantly keep up with the less damage taken while keeping enemies away from you with fear and also one-shotting them under the kill threshold. So this makes the build extremely mobile and also great for mapping before you go for the boss. Once you go for the boss, you go for this particular setup with summoning zombies. So now coming over to the skill rotations and the tips for the build. You can see right away when our friend starts the fight, he will be buffing his Wraith Lord. Now he will be teleporting together with Wraith Lord from the experimental Affix. And yes, I did forget to mention, but I kinda assumed you guys know about this one. So the Wraith Lord is stationary. The Wraith Lord cannot move because of this passive, while gaining tons of damage in exchange. So what is happening is, he will be blinking around and this will relocate the Wraith Lord. Because he has lower blinking cooldowns, he can afford to dodge skills while letting the Wraith Lord reposition as he blink, as he dances his way across the corruption. You can see in most of the fights, he's not running into the fights directly head on, he will be retreating, he will be moving around, and he will be taking better positioning. So this is not going to be a build that will run heading into the corruption. He will be using his Wraith Lord as the tank and also the biggest source of damage. Now with the ability to gain additional warding while killing strong enemies, over here this is a previous demonstration. After killing the Exalted Mage as he blink onto the mage, he will be gaining tons of warding. Notice that he was up to 60,000 warding. So as you play the map in higher corruptions, you do want to take advantage of the unique effects of your relic. And this is one of the biggest defensiveness for the build. And finally, coming over to the fight against bosses. So what you kind of want to do is, you want to prepare yourself, and here what our friend is doing is, he is summoning tons of zombies by casting or drinking potions. And from the experimental effect over here, he drink about 10 potions, and this maximizes the damage for the Wraith Lord for the next 10 seconds. And then jump into the fight. For the next 7 or 8 seconds, Wraith Lord deals millions and also millions of more damage. And notice that he's using the Wraith Lord as a tank. And this is also the method he's using against the Shade. So as you guys can see over here, before the Shade appears, he will be providing his Wraith Lord with tons of food. And then if you look at the damage closely, the first few hits against the Shade are over 16 or 18 million damage. And then the damage will go down to 3, 4, 2 million damage, but this is already doing so much damage to the Shade in the first 5 seconds. To finish the boss off, he will be blinking onto the boss using Transplant, because there's a threshold mechanics, and this will allow him to one-shot the boss once he gets to under 15%, like over here. And before we finish, some of the viewers has mentioned about the ability to snapshot when the Wraith Lord is summoned. You can see that there is also discussion on this particular video from Lulu, and people were saying, hey, how come you're not snapshotting the Wraith Lord with additional minion damage, and then go with summons and also go with additional damage? I do think a lot of players are aware of this one, but they're not using the snapshot effect too greatly. And if you guys are not sure what's happening with the snapshot, is that players having items that it has increased minion damage crafted and purposely use those items to summon the Wraith Lord, and then they will switch back to other gears when the Wraith Lord is summoned. You can use this method to deal even more damage after using the snapshot effect. So I thought I'd mention about this one because some of the viewers has been asking about this concept in previous videos. But because it can be a little tedious to constantly swapping gears for the snapshotting effect, and this is why some of the players in the latest stage of the game, they just use the same gears how they fight and also when they summon the Wrath Lord. Now if you guys find my videos and also guides helpful, and also want to support my passion in making more guides and also more videos for the last Epoch and also more games to come like Path of Exile, please consider joining me on Patreon, and also here I have created my Ko-Fi page. You can also support me directly through donations, but supporting me continuously with one of those memberships will mean a lot for my future updated videos and to become financially sustainable so I can be continuing making videos for you guys and doing what I love the most, and that is to share and also teach our communities as I dive into different games and making more guides for you guys. And as you guys are going to see in the future, I'll have different ranks and also perk advantages and also special events and also special features for members like account reviews, perfecting the build for you guys, and also co-op time play, and also even special future videos for you guys on your special build for different members.